In the history of Hollywood, few stars have so captured the imagination of fans as R2-D2, the feisty astrodroid made famous in Star Wars. Yet his background, even after 25 years in the limelight, remains a mystery.
I think he said he worked in like catering or something.
He was a stunt unit, he was a stunt droid.
He trained with the June Taylor dancers years ago, and he was just, you know, he's a hoofer.
I'm not real sure that accent is like the real deal. You know, I mean, homeboy is probably like from Detroit or somewhere.
Born in the sleepy London suburb of Bollocks, R2-D2's greatest early influence was his father, a third-generation mounted policeman. But from an early age, R2 was destined to disappoint him.
Dad always expected us to follow in his footsteps, but we couldn't get Reg to get his leg over the steed, so at that point my father started treating him differently.
Unable to please a father he adored, R2 sought approval elsewhere.
He went off to acting school. You know, he always liked being the center of attention, so it sort of fit, didn't it?
In the freewheeling London of the 1960s, R2 discovered a freedom he never dreamed of back in Bollocks. For the first time in his life, R2 felt like he belonged.
He was doing Panto up in Bristol, and he was doing an amazing production in A Christmas Carol. He was Tiny Tim.
R2's creative talents went beyond acting. Along the way, he met a man who would become a lifelong friend.
We had an interest in music, and we were both drummers. I grew up at the time with the Beatles, playing in the clubs, and we often jammed together. Those were good times, and that was, I think music was his outlet.
I think he liked being in the spotlight.
Father was singularly unimpressed.
Tortured by his father's rejection, R2 poured himself into music.
He was partying with Ringo, having tea with Hendrix, and that was the summer of love. He headed west to the epicenter and ended up running with some really radical people in California.
I first met R2 many years ago. He was just a young, aspiring droid, you know, innocent and very sweet-natured. He doesn't even remember me now.
I'd heard that he was doing some experimental dance. You know, that was sort of in the 60s. I don't think anybody remembers anything about what happened in those years.
R2 quickly found work on American television, playing a variety of supporting roles.
You know, in like Starsky and Hutch, they were throwing those cans around, trash cans. That's how he got started.
He did a couple stints on That's My Mama.
True to Hollywood tradition, R2 had a series of tumultuous love affairs.
Well, I always liked short guys, and he was my ultimate short guy. He had that one great eye. I loved looking into that eye.
We actually tried to get him, R2-D2, in The Godfather.
If I remember correctly, he wanted him for the Michael Corleone role.
Since I read the book, I mean, I could just see him in those scenes when he's walking through the Sicilian countryside with the two bodyguards with their shotguns. And so kind of that image always made me persist in trying to get him the part, but they didn't see it. Bob Evans called him a runt.
But The Godfather's second unit director, a young filmmaker named George Lucas, saw exactly what he needed for his new film, Star Wars.
In the very, very first script, R2 is described as a trash can on wheels. And that's one of the reasons why I saw him. I said, this guy's perfect. You know, I hope he speaks English.
March 1976. Filming begins in Tunisia. Though already a veteran of stage and television, R2's transition to feature films proves difficult.
It was a huge burden on R2 to really carry the very first scene in Star Wars. He had the second line of dialogue in the whole film.
Did you hear that? They shut down the main reactor. We'll be destroyed for sure.
Under the intense spotlight of a major feature film, R2's nerves frayed.
Probably the biggest fear he had was he had to appear in a scene with Alec Guinness. And that was a huge opportunity for him. I know he was really nervous that day. He got sick the morning before that.
The pressure proved too much. R2 had to be treated for exhaustion.
Despite R2's strengths, he's insecure. There's some insecure programming somewhere in his system.
I think it's easy for people to forget that he has feelings. When you're at crotch height, it's hard to make a good impression.
Displaying the feisty courage which would become his trademark, R2 was back on the set the next day. He nailed the scene with Guinness in one take.
R2 is a brilliant actor. His timing is impeccable. He's like a machine.
I first met R2 in 1976. I had gone to visit George at his company, the studio, and I was just drinking some water from a small styrofoam cup. And I went to throw my cup away, and I saw this trash can in the corner, and I walked over to it. The lid wouldn't come off. And this whole thing began to squeak and bleep and make all these noises. And I kicked it 3 or 4 times. It fell over. And then George said, "What are you doing to R2?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to throw my styrofoam cup away in this trash can." He said, "That's not a trash can, that's R2-D2.
It was a mistake no one would ever make again. The following year, R2 became a part of American culture.
Star Wars was a huge success. He came back, he was a star. The mayor gave him a key to the city. They named a bypass after him, the R2-D2. It was wonderful.
There was only one thing missing from R2's triumphant return home.
Dad was unimpressed, so he refused to acknowledge Reg's accomplishments.
R2's troubled relationship with his father would haunt him all his life. By the late 70s, R2 found himself in that rarefied pantheon of American screen icons. Fame had a profound effect on the little droid.
He really worked so hard on that first film, and I think it was during the second and third that things really changed.
You know, you're that young and you get a home run, your first major feature. It put a lot of pressure on him to outdo himself.
He was, making demands and having his publicists and his entourage.
And then he went through the whole, Grand Star thing and, demanding trailers and Winnebagos and God knows what all.
At the height of his fame, R2 took a vacation in Manhattan. There, he became friends with an up-and-coming performer.
I was like a young actor in New York, kind of struggling, and I hadn't met anybody really famous before then, and all of a sudden, he's like a household name. Everybody is R2-D2, and I'm like telling people, I know him.
There was, perhaps, something in the aspiring actor that reminded R2 of himself.
He tried to hook me up with an agent, and it's just been very good to me, throughout my whole career.
With the release of The Empire Strikes Back in 1980, R2 began to set his sights beyond Star Wars.
I think he really wanted to be in the Indiana Jones series.
So as soon as he heard that Steven and I were doing something, he immediately said, can I have the lead in this?
One day in the prop department, we found him and he had the hat and the whip.
Well, as an actor, you have to understand that R2 is limited.
He used to say he would like to have been a Shakespearean actor.
He could carry a spear.
He heard, I think it's Kenneth Branagh was doing Richard III, and he auditioned for The Hump, and he was very sad not to get it.
I did see him do Friar Tuck at a certain point, and he was quite good at that. But he's just too old now for those roles.
R2's success had become a sort of prison.
He wanted out. I think he really wanted to get on and do other things. I know that he wanted to really be in a Western. By the time he became a star, there weren't that many being made.
I don't think he's going to get, romantic leads. He is really more of a character actor.
The starring roles R2 yearned for never materialized.
He made a lot of bad choices, I think, and he had a terrible agent and manager.
The end of the Star Wars trilogy seemed to be the end of R2's career as well.
After the completion of Return of the Jedi, all of us went off to other things in our career, and R2 was left in his beach house in Malibu with nothing to do, watch the tide come in and out. It was a dark time for him.
A lot of things went on during those lost years.
He just kind of did a few independent films, and then he was doing some commercials.
I heard that he had, on the side, without telling anybody, had done some dinner theater.
No event contributed more to R2's downfall than the good fortune of a close friend.
I know very well that Rick and R2 were friends at one point. They used to hang out together and party together. That after Rick's Academy Award, R2 didn't talk about him anymore.
Well, we haven't spoken in a long time. And I'm not surprised that he was unhappy that I won, because he and I have been at odds.
He's a keen follower of the Academy Awards.
I don't think he's an actor. I think he's a personality. Notice that no one else hires him. Notice that.
Not being nominated was a tremendous disappointment to him, and I think he felt that he'd let the family down. Especially my father.
It was clear that R2 had made enemies on his climb to the top.
I just want you to know that he's not the happy-go-lucky, rollicky little robot that he appears to be, that he's got a dark side. This is where they got that phrase, by the way, the dark side.
Through it all, the man who discovered him remained loyal.
I don't think George is aware. No who's going to walk up to George and say, R2-D2 is a schmuck.
Anxious to help R2, George Lucas made a call to an old friend.
At one point, George asked me, is there a place for him in Private Ryan? And for a while, I considered making him a beach obstacle.
It was not to be. R2's life spiraled downward.
I mean, R2, at a certain point, he started drinking a lot.
I went to see him. He was living in a cabin, just alone. Didn't take care of himself. He was rusty. He had let his hair grow.
He is somebody that I felt could have benefited very much from Prozac.
R2 had finally hit rock bottom. From the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, R2-D2 lived in obscurity. But that would all change with one phone call.
George decided that he was going to try R2 again for Phantom Menace.
He had sent me a few little notes here and there saying, gee, when are we going to do the next movie? Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. Why don't you do another Star Wars?
We had a very difficult time in tracking him down and finally found him. He was doing dinner theater in Sarasota, Florida.
When we came back to do The Phantom Menace, he was very excited to be a part of it, and I think he was relieved that his life had direction again.
But before he could return to work, R2 had to get in shape.
My team was assigned to get him ready for the physical demands of Episode 1, so we had him on a treadmill for about an hour a day.
R2 hit the weights, and the pounds melted away.
He showed up on the set. There he was, all cleaned up. He looked great. It excited all of us to see him again.
As soon as he comes onto set, it was Star Wars for real.
Without him, this wouldn't be Star Wars.
The honeymoon was not to last.
I think the trouble on Phantom Menace started when a script was sent to R2, and he marked it all up and sent it back with a lot of notes to George.
If he can kind of beef up his dialogue, he will.
Not only does he ad-lib his lines, but he actually goes off in the wrong direction, and he goes anywhere he wants. I mean, he's actually doing another movie.
The other day he had a line with Obi-Wan, right, and he was meant to say, right, and instead he said, and thought that like none of us would know it. You don't talk droid, do you?
The incident with Obi-Wan, played by Scottish actor Ewan McGregor, was symptomatic of a deeper problem.
If he had his way, he'd have Ewan's part. And I think Ewan kind of knows that.
The other day he said, "Out my way, you Scottish wanker," to Ewan.
No, R2's changed. I mean, he's not the same droid he was. He was actually quite humble when I found him.
He slags off the other actors. I know that he always slags off George.
As time went on, the problems deepened.
Sometimes he comes to set and can't even remember who he is.
There's been rumor that he likes to drink.
I think there are times that, he might use a little too much oil.
R2 blamed his performance problems on the director.
He says that George basically didn't ever give him any direction whatsoever, that he did everything himself.
You know, Rick Dreyfuss and a lot of the other actors have always complained that I treat the actors like robots.
His favorite direction is faster, more intense.
Yeah, it's faster and more intense, or same thing, only better.
And that may be true. I've never really had a problem with a droid. You just push the remote and they go where you want them to go, except for R2. You push the remote, doesn't do what you want him to do, argues about everything, is always constantly trying to get into his character, always wants to know his motivation. There was a point where we had a very difficult time. I kind of lost it a little bit. And I did light up a blowtorch in front of him, but I didn't use it.
R2 told friends he was holding the production together single-handedly.
R2 thinks he is the star of Star Wars, and this is something I've talked to him about. I said, there are other people in it, me, for instance.
When it's his close-up, I give him my full performance, and then when it's my close-up, he just reads it from a little page, and it affects my work.
As problems mounted, George Lucas began to ponder the unthinkable.
There was a discussion that we might create a digital R2.
He could just be gone, and nobody would know the difference. Probably, the CG R2 would be much, much better and would be on time in the morning.
It's when the girls started coming around.
It's these girls, man, in these short dresses and these tight clothes, man. It's like something he hadn't been exposed to.
He certainly doesn't have any problem attracting them, so there must be something there.
I guess it's just the way he looks. I can't deny that he's a good-looking robot.
R2's penchant for the ladies was complicated by the fact that he was now in a committed relationship.
He has a lot of other girlfriends, but I'm his only girlfriend.
Every week you go by his spot, man, it's like, 3, 4 chicks laying around there, hanging around his pool.
There have been times when R2 has been promiscuous.
If you put a private eye on him, you'd be amazed.
However understanding I tried to be, I can't accept that. My parents raised me not to accept being cheated on by a robot.
If his romantic problems weren't enough, R2 was suddenly overwhelmed when word came from England. His father was dead.
It was a shock to us all, and it was difficult to break the news to R2 as we hadn't spoken in years.
He did not take it very well.
R2 was nearing a crisis point.
Oh, man!
Once his father died, I knew the pressure was building in him and something was going to blow.
He's gone mad!
And it happened. It eventually happened there in Sydney.
Distraught over the death of his father, R2 staged a stunt that shocked everyone around him.
He's trying to prove to himself that he was strong enough to face anything.
Well, I think that leap part of it was just a stunt to get attention. It really comes out of the Indiana Jones thing. Both Steven and I said, you know, you really aren't going to be up for these stunts. And he said, oh, I can do that, I can do that. And I think part of this was a call, especially after his father died, to branch out and prove that he could do a lot of the things he'd been bragging about.
His terrified fans begged him not to do it. But R2 was determined. Suddenly, everything went horribly wrong.
This is crazy, Don. We're really going to do something. He's out of control.
Let me see him. Let me see him. Let me see him. Come on, let me see him. Let me listen. He's fine. He's fine. Oh, my God.
We were able to resuscitate him by acting quickly and preserving all his body parts.
Jumped. Does anybody have his arm? No, I think it's coming. You know what? I'm sorry.
R2's near-death experience changed him forever.
When I called him in the hospital, he was overwhelmed. He could barely speak. He was particularly touched by the messages of support from the fans.
His demons behind him, R2 emerged from the ordeal stronger than ever.
After that jump, I think he began to come to his senses. I began to see the old R2, the inner core, the loving R2 came back.
R2 returned triumphantly to the set of Episode 2, proving an inspiration to everyone around him.
I think the main reason I did Episode 2 is because I wanted to do a picture with R2-D2. I don't, as yet, have any scenes with R2-D2, but I'm going to have a word with George.
He's trying a little harder this time. I could tell.
In fact, R2 was a changed man. He began to devote himself to his favorite causes.
He does a lot for kids. He loves kids, and he's constantly going out of his way to sign autographs and entertain kids, and wherever there's a kids' charity, you're going to see R2.
This guy, if people only knew, man, what he does, he's like one of the most benevolent cats in the world.
You know, his generosity goes in many ways. I mean, he shared things with me. He's given me some of his parts sometime. I mean, you know, not Shakespeare, I mean, like bits of metal. But, you know, whatever he can, he gives.
Overcoming his anguished family history, conquering his professional frustrations, R2-D2 has emerged, triumphant once again.
He's had a very difficult life, and given that, I think he copes very well with it.
The inner core of R2 is a loving, kindly being.
He's my man, you know. He's done stuff for me, man, that nobody else would do.
He even won back the love of his life, and perhaps the best is yet to come.
I think I might be pregnant.